Bandwidth for changelog is provided by Fastly. Learn more at fastly.com.
I'm Jason Laster, and you're listening to The Changelog.
Back, everyone. This is the Changelog, and I'm your host, Adam Stacoviak. This is episode 247, and today Jared and I talked to Jason Laster about Firefox Debugger and DevTools. We talked about the backstory of Firefox, Firebug, the new Debugger.html, why React and Redux make a good fit for developing Debugger as a standalone application, community efforts, and also how to get started. We have 3 sponsors: Linode, TopTal, and GoCD. First sponsor of the show is our friends at Linode. We host everything we do on Linode servers. Head to linode.com/changelog. Get one of the fastest, most efficient SSD cloud servers, SSD storage, 40 gigabit network, Intel E5 processors. Use the code changelog 2017, $20 in credit. Head to linode.com/changelog. And now on to the show. All right, we're back with a fun show today, Jared. This time talking about something from Firefox, debugging, DevTools, this fun thing. Jason Laster is coming on, kind of peeling back the layer of the history of some things for us and hopefully sharing with us where they're going.
Yeah, well, we're all excited because if there's one thing that developers love, it's tooling.
Yeah.
And it's DevTools specifically because they're approachable, you can dive deep into them, and of course they help us do our jobs better. So very excited to talk about this. Jason, thanks for joining us. And real quick, a shout out to Brian Clark, who teed up this conversation. He, in fact, said have Jason on and have James Long on as well.
Which we
because
did.
Opened this issue on Ping back when he worked at Mozilla. And Brian's the technical product manager for the Firefox DevTools over there. So thanks, Brian. And Jason, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to do it.
So I'd like to start off with a little bit of history because I feel like Firefox has a rich history in DevTools, specifically, Firebug, which we all know is a third-party add-on released by, who was it? It was Joe Hewitt, right? Back in 2006. Really kind of kicked off tooling inside of the browser. Before that, it was just you throw an alert in there and then you see object pop up,
Right.
And you just want to pull your hair out. But a rich history and a lot has changed over the years. But before we get into that, Jason, tell us about you work for Mozilla. Give us a little bit of just the background of you at Mozilla.
Sure. I've been at Mozilla for 1 year now. And prior to that, I guess it all began for me when I graduated college. And I did this program called Recurse Center, which is just this magical place where you can go for 3 months and contribute open source, explore new language, anything like that. And
That used to go by a different name?
It used to be Hacker School, which was a totally bad name. Yeah.
Why
not
did they
great if
rename
you were
it?
trying to find-
Recurse?
Recurse, I think it has this resonance with a developer, like we're recursing into something. And frankly, Hacker School just didn't really work well if you were crossing the border and you want to tell a border agent, yeah, I'm going to Hacker School. Doesn't work.
Very practical problem with that name.
At least that's my understanding of it. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I've definitely heard of that and people rave about it.
Oh yeah. You meet the most amazing people who are doing, and they have fellows come in like Maureen, who works on CodeMirror and ProseMirror, and Jose Valim, who's worked on Elixir. And I got there and I had just graduated college and done a little bit of programming and knew I hated that feeling when you're working on something and it just doesn't work and you're not quite sure why. And I thought I could spend a little bit of time just getting involved in open source so that would never happen again. And that's how I stumbled upon working on REPLs for Ruby and Python and realizing that you can actually do this stuff. It's possible. And I was kind of hooked and had wanted to get involved ever since. And then when I started working in the web, seriously, it made sense to go to DevTools in the browser as opposed to maybe like a repo for Ruby or something. So 2 years ago, I started working on a Chrome DevTools extension. And I realized then that while you could do a lot in a tab, like the React DevTools and whatnot, what was really cool was if you could do something in the tools themselves, in the inspector, in the debugger. And the day I figured out like that was open source was just the rest is history. It was really neat.
So since you're somewhat new at Mozilla and with Firefox, we'd like to cover a little bit of the backstory of where the DevTools have been and where they're going. Of course, will be a large meat of this conversation, specifically the debugger, which is very interesting. But just real quick, do you work on all the DevTools? Are you like specifically on the debugger, or do you cross tooling?
Yeah, so most people on the team will cross tooling, work on the console, the inspector. I joined primarily to work on the debugger, and since then have been working on this rewrite. And I'm one of the exceptions in that while the other tools are interesting for me, I really want to stay on the debugger, and I'd like to see it change quite a bit because I think there's a lot we can do. So I see myself staying on the debugger for some time, at least until we make some progress.
Until you're done with it.
Yeah, yeah.
Because you're never done with software, right?
That's right. That's sort of a trick question, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Or a trick statement, I should say.
Right. So let's paint a little bit of the backstory. Even though you just got there, Adam and I don't know a little bit. We've been around. So Firefox, as I stated before, really broke in, for me at least, and I hope this resonates. I think it does. With Firebug back in 2006 and as it got popular, and even other add-ons, really the ability to make add-ons to Firefox really allowed developers to open up the browser.
For sure.
Yeah, and to peer inside and to actually move beyond the alert debugging that we were tied to.
Sure. Yeah, that was my experience as well. I distinctly remember installing Firebug, and then everything seemed like it was possible. Like the first inspector, everything was there.
So back at that time, Firefox had a huge mind share with developers, and Firebug was it. Like it's what you used, and it was best in breed tooling. And then I'm not sure exactly when it was. I searched for this real quick, couldn't find it. Chrome comes out, WebKit begins to have, Chrome and Safari have WebKit. You have the WebKit inspector and the dev tools coming there. And really, the perception of Firefox is that because it was third party or the first party tooling wasn't really there, and Chrome dev tools really took off and became, at least today, I would say in my mind, the juggernaut in the dev tool space. And I'm just curious, like your take on that, and maybe even insights on why that happened from your perspective.
Sure. So Firebug was really, really good. To this day, it has features that we don't have in Firefox DevTools, and frankly, Chrome doesn't have either. So I think there was this mentality at Mozilla that the community is really powerful and can do a lot. So Firebug had employed some people. My manager now was one of the first people to work on Firebug, which is unbelievable.
Wow.
And so I tell him ideas I have for the future. He's like, yeah, we did that. And it's really hard to stump him.
That's got to be awesome.
So
someone with this experience around.
Yeah. Yeah, I had to confess, like a couple months into working with them, that he was kind of my hero, and that was a nice moment. We were both drinking, and you have a lot of people around when you're at Mozilla who have done things that just blow your mind. Like the history of computer science kind of like flows through some of these people.
Right.
So, I mean, we can go into that later on, but source maps and even Emacs and version control and whatnot. But Firebug was really successful. They had a great contributor team, lots of contributions. And I think that fit the mentality at the time that this problem was mostly being handled. Probably up until Chrome DevTools got started and started really refining it. So maybe 2-3 years ago, a larger team got formed, that's my understanding, around DevTools in the browser as a thing that employees would work on and build out. And the other piece of this was Firefox OS. So because Mozilla was working on both a desktop app and a mobile operating system that was built on the web platform, there was a split focus. So there's this amazing tooling built out called the Web IDE that allows you to work on a mobile app, mobile OS even, through this tooling in Firefox. But I would wager to bet that because of this split focus, it was harder to keep up. And with Firefox OS becoming less of a focus and then not becoming a focus at the beginning of last year, we've been able to make a lot of progress just improving the quality of the UI and the experience within Firefox DevTools.
So the refocus makes a lot of sense, I guess. And maybe this question is quote unquote above your pay grade, but like the decision to refocus, maybe you don't have insights on this, but maybe you do. Was there kind of was there like a holy crap moment? Like everyone's using Chrome now, and like where'd our core audience go? Because developers and techies and nerds, like us folk, were Firefox's bread and butter, and they're its champions and for years and years and years. And there had to be a moment where it's like everyone's using Chrome DevTools now. What are we going to do?
Yeah.
You think that happened?
Sure.
Sure.
I think. I think you have that recognition internally. Yeah. I think you both put out really exciting tech, like great features, and it doesn't resonate. And on the flip side, you look at the larger product and you realize, we really want to think through some of these experiences. So I'm not sure if it was 18 months ago or 2 years ago, but Brian Clark joined the team. He'd been at Mozilla for some time. And we really got a product mentality, design, full-time design. And just internally, there was a recognition that we could do better. And I think that's true for DevTools at large. Products like Atom and Nuclide and VS Code and Chrome DevTools has a full-time designer, but that wasn't really a thing 3 years ago.
Yeah.
So about the same time 3 years ago. We're like, hey, these tools built for developers aren't any different than like tools built for other humans. Let's apply some of the same practices and really focus on what the experience that will help beginners, but also help advanced programmers do what they're trying to do.
Yeah. And that's been a welcome change recently that I've noticed is like you said, treating these things as if they're designed for humans and not like, it's okay, they're developers, they'll put up with whatever. And just focus on design and tooling, even down to to compilers and to like error messages and these kind of things that we're seeing out of like the Elm community. And that's starting to, move its way through where it's like the compiler and these things can be like human usable, and that makes people like them. It kind of seems like duh, but at the same time, it speaks a little bit to the maturation of our industry, I guess, but it's definitely welcome.
Yeah, I'm one of those people who believes that things could be radically different in 2 to 5 years. So I tell my parents that I'm working on like Photoshop for the web. I don't mean Dreamweaver, but I just mean that there's going to be this degree of like fluidity when you're working in a language that has type checking and Elm with error messages, and the way in which you can design a page will feel more fluid, and hopefully the same thing as like developing a new widget for your app or component for your app. Like that's where I see us going. But with that mentality, like we still have a long ways to go to really nail it.
So while we're still kind of camping out on the history, I have to bring up 3D view because at a certain point I switched to Chrome and the WebKit side, and I used Chrome DevTools. Even to this day, I use Chrome DevTools.
Yeah.
And there was one reason why I always fired up Firefox, and that's because 3D view was like a fun gimmick. So it was like not even useful, kind of useful, which may be why it's gone now, but it's gone. And for those who don't recall, 3D view, 3D view was this cool part of, I think it was a first party part of your guys' tooling, where you could basically tilt the web page on its side and see the DOM built out kind of based on the nested tree structure. You could see it in 3D. And so it was helpful, like kind of to like sometimes you see something's too far nested or it's not actually inside the element you thought it was going to be. But it was really a cool tech demo. And I was recalling that as Adam and I were prepping for this, and I thought, what happened to 3D view? It's no longer there.
Yeah. So I recently saw a screenshot from, I think it was Firefox 17, and I'm not sure when that was released, but it was one of the earliest versions of a DevTools that we built. It wasn't Firebug. And you're looking at the inspector and you see the markup view, which is that DOM tree. And then on the right in content is the role view. Like it didn't have a debugger. I'm not even sure if it had a console, but it did have 3D view in the bottom. So I just have to believe that it was one of the first things that was built. And I was like, hey, it's pretty rad. Like, let's get a topography view of your page. And I think it's a great example of something that's cool, but it didn't help people in the same way that probably a more focused tool would. Like, for instance, I was talking to one of the people who works on the inspector the other day about just Z indices. Like, can we get a sense of, like, if we have 3 elements that are all the same dimensions on top of each other, can you see the 2 below it, below the top one? You can't really see that. And even if they overlap a bit, can you find a way, like with our tooling, to inspect or put a magnifying glass on that second layer? It's kind of difficult without something like tilt view, which I don't know. That's probably not the solution, but
when people are still explaining the box model too, and I don't think it exactly clearly identifies the box model because it's not particularly trying to show the padding and all that stuff, but you can see the layering, and so you can see the hierarchy, and you can see what's above one another. That to me seems very, very useful, but maybe as Jared said, it's sort of just a gimmick. But not really.
Well, it's like Jason said, it's like kind of useful, but not useful enough to be like something you grab all the time, right?
Yeah.
But I actually like that idea of the Z-index view because let's face it, like people when they want to crank the Z-index on something, they'll put like 10,000 on it, right? So that raises that element. I don't know why, but I do it too, I guess. Or like you can just crank it up real high.
Or something bang important.
Right. It's like this thing has to be on top. So they just and then if you want something that's actually going to be, Z index higher than that, now you got to go find whoever, where they put it. And it would be cool to have something like that. And just pro tip for people out there, like 1, 2, 3 works,
Yeah, and it's like in tilt view, you saw that element like way off in like the clouds, and then you're like, that doesn't really make any sense.
That doesn't need to be that high. Like 1 is higher than 0. It still works. But
going back to tilt, I was told in the early days that the toolbox, which is everything like in its own window, was always V1, and V2 was supposed to be like Photoshop again, where you have those like panels that are all over content. And you can kind of like move them around and play with them, and lots of highlighters everywhere. Obviously, that came to be probably for the reasons of it's very hard to implement and not really clear why you do that. But I think from the beginning, there was this idea of like maybe we can directly visualize or like edit, manipulate the DOM, the page you're looking at.
Yeah, I really think that your description of the split focus with Firefox OS, and really because here you have an example of like you said it was V1, there was supposed to be a V2. You have good ideas, but they're not like fully fleshed out, right? And they're not explored. And so perhaps because of that split focus, perhaps because the thought that community will carry certain aspects, and so I'm excited to see that Mozilla with Firefox DevTools has kind of doubled back down their efforts and hired people. You work on the debugger, and that's your gig, and that's awesome. So we want to talk about the present, where it's at, the new debugger. It's React and Redux, modern tooling. It's can run anywhere. So they have a lot of questions around that, and we will talk about those after this first break.
If you're looking for trusted freelance talent ready to join your team right now, I mean like within the week, call upon my friends at TopTal, TOPTAL.com. And as a listener of the show, you might actually be one of those developers or designers looking for awesome freelance, independent contractor type opportunities where you can still be a remote worker. You can still have the freedom you have right now, which means you can travel anywhere, you can be anywhere and do what you do. That's also an opportunity. We love TopTal. They've been supporting this show for a very long time. They're really good friends of ours. If you want a personal introduction, I'd be glad to give that to you. Email me, adam@changelog.com. Otherwise, head to toptal.com. That's TOPTAL.com to learn more. Tell them Adam from Changelog sent you. And now back to the show.
All right, we are back speaking with Jason Laster about the Firefox debugger and the DevTools in general. Got a little bit of the history in the last segment, and we see this renewed focus over the last couple of years from Mozilla on making Firefox DevTools great and really a first-class, first-party effort in the Firefox ecosystem. And one of the ways that that's happening is that, of course, you have an open source project that makes tons of sense. Like that's Mozilla styles, open source. But this is not a project inside of the Firefox repo. This is its own thing, Debugger.html. We'll have a link to the show notes to the GitHub. It lives on its own repo, and it has its own little ecosystem around it. So tell us about that.
So about a month or two in, Brian realized that we could attract more contributors by virtue of being in GitHub and our own repo. So initially, it was always about an experiment. Can we move quickly and try this new React Redux architecture? But 2 months in, he came to us and said, in the early days of Firefox, it was expected that every engineer would have about 6 contributors. That was how you got the leverage. And that had gone down over time. But by using these modern tools, React and Redux, which people understood, and being in GitHub, which means a contributor could get started by doing git clone, npm install, npm start, we could really talk to more contributors again. And that's what we've pulled off. And that's what's been so exciting the past year. We've had over 100 people get involved and help out, which is just way, way more people than we were seeing in the mono repo previously.
You have your own org. It's DevTools-HTML. You've got lots of cool stuff there. Perf.html. I'm assuming that's performance. That's spot on.
Yep.
Debugger, of course, .html. You got DevTools core and a bunch of stuff even here, even Debugger Docker. You said you primarily camp out in Debugger though, right?
I do.
And you also mentioned the old way. Maybe just give us a 2-minute old way of how it wasn't working, mostly for those maintainers out there thinking like I should mono repo this thing, that's the way to contributors. But in actuality, maybe it's a more distributed model, a more broken down model where you're sort of better defining. Can you help us understand what was wrong with the old way?
So there was a lot right about it too. The mono repo would allow you to clone Firefox, and then in one patch, you could change the JavaScript engine, JavaScript debugger server, and then the client, which was incredibly powerful. Now, the downside, and this is a lot like Chromium today, which is one tree as well, is that when you do that clone, you're pulling down like 5 gigs, a lot of it history. And then when you do the build, you're taking another 30 minutes maybe. And then to see your change, you actually have to do Firefox run, mock run, to open your own version of Firefox. So the process was incredibly powerful, and it allowed big things to change all at once. But it didn't appeal to maybe a contributor who just wanted to get started really quickly and try something before dinner. And if all you're doing is working on that really cool UI feature for the debugger, you don't need, I guess, to change the DOM directory, or you don't need to go into the JavaScript directory and like fiddle with some C++. That just isn't helpful.
Right.
In fact, that's really scary, right? Like most projects, the JS directory is like where your JavaScript code lives. And in our project, the JS directory is like the C++ that, compiles to, it's insane.
Right. Well, a web browser is a huge project, huge beast. So it makes sense that you wouldn't want to get the mono repo for new contributors. But so to be clear, Firefox DevTools has, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like 7 top level tabs. Adam mentioned performance. You got the debugger tab. So might make sense to say, well, let's have a DevTools repo. That's just the DevTools, but houses all of those. Was there a conversation around, when you break out of the mono repo, how small do you go? Or because you're just representing a single tab.
Yeah. Initially, it was just, let's see if we can do this experiment. And then, of course, we'll go back to the mono repo. That's where everything lives. At this point, maybe let's say we started in March of last year. Around December, we as a team realized, we can go much faster if we're in GitHub. There's no going back. But how do we bring the other tools to GitHub? And it's a challenge because some of them aren't necessarily ready for contributors. They haven't been refactored to React. They don't have the documentation ready to get started. And we really built out that infrastructure for the debugger to run in a tab that we would have to apply to the other tools. So we've started doing that. The net monitor obviously runs in a tab. Perf.html runs in a tab. But other things like the inspector, still a work in progress. Console, still a work in progress.
So they're essentially isolated apps then?
Within the Firefox, you might treat them as one application. But when you split something out, you can really say this is one app with maybe some shared libraries. And the shared libraries are where things become a little bit difficult. But so far, it's been possible.
This is a big risk then. I mean, to break it down to that level, you're going from what you knew before to get back to, let's just say, mindshare, developer mindshare. Let's even throw the word again in there because I think you mentioned it too. But you really took a risk to sort of break down your old model that had its benefits, obviously.
Sure.
But there were areas where you just weren't attracting the new contributors or drive-by contributors, those who want to just jump in on smaller things or some of the things you mentioned there. You took a big risk to go this route. Was there a lot of discussion about risk versus reward in that scenario?
Absolutely. And it's still a contentious discussion. Now, we've had some successes in the past. For instance, Nick Fitzgerald, maybe 3 years ago, made the source map library, which is on GitHub, and everyone uses it for mapping from a generated file, like a bundle file, to the original files. So VS Code uses it, I believe. Chrome DevTools forked it. So we have experience doing open source outside the tree, but never at this scale. And we're still trying to figure it out.
What's with the .html piece on all these? Is that to sort of like identify to those passerbys, like, hey, this, I can pull down Debugger.html, and as you mentioned before, can run in its own tab. It can, for lack of better terms, it can be its own application with some shared libraries, but it, when it's inside of Firefox, it's part of a single app, basically. Is that what it's supposed to mean, or what's the idea there?
I'm glad you asked. It's that, but it's a lot more than that as well. So before the rewrite, the debugger was largely written in two technologies that are so Firefox, Zool and JSM. And I'll just take a minute to explain each one, and you'll see why it was so important that we go about this. The history of Firefox was add-ons, a large part, like Firebug, incredibly successful add-on, and other add-ons on well. And Zool was what underpinned these add-ons. It stands for XML UI library. And it was kind of like what you would build if you were a browser and wanted shared libraries before there was maybe like React or Angular. What Zool lets you do as a browser is define new elements. So like instead of building your select tag or your input, you'd have like a drop down, or you might have like a tooltip or popover written in XML with like embedded JavaScript, but you wouldn't worry about that because anybody could just use them. Now, this worked really well for the add-on story, which would just run in Firefox. But fast forward to 2016, and we've got this really complicated app built largely in Zool, and we didn't know what to do. There wasn't really a path forward because it was very difficult to debug. You'd be really scared if you had to make a change to one of these components. And so we wanted to do something that was HTML, like web friendly, and not like a browser technology. And that's where the idea of HTML came from. The other technology was JSM, which is JavaScript, but once again, like only runs in the browser behind the scenes in a special context and is privileged. So like this privileged JavaScript can do all the things you're told you shouldn't do. It can create context menus and cross-origin requests, speak directly to the browser, and you just list it out. And it's wonderful if you have that superpower. But once again, you try to go anywhere and you can't run a JSM file. Like that's not going to work. And then you look at your front end and your back end, and they're calling these methods that are only available in that context. So we really wanted to focus on web technologies that could run anywhere. And that's one of the reasons why we did this rewrite.
You just brought back a huge amount of memories from my college days, because I remember I looked at Zool, and this was when I was like a fledgling developer, and I wanted to hack on Firefox somehow, like an add-on. I don't remember. But I remember back then, I mean, I was just getting started. I opened up some XML and like was trying to follow a tutorial, and I was completely overwhelmed by Zool. I remember a feeling of, it wasn't imposter syndrome. It was like I was actually an imposter. Like I did not belong there. And I just forgot all about that until you started talking about it. So that being said, I mean, HTML is much more accessible for people than something that's, I'm not saying it was proprietary. I'm thinking it wasn't, but specific, right? Like vendor specific tooling. Whereas here it's like, hey, it's HTML. Okay. That brings with it its own baggage, which we'll talk about, React and Redux and stuff. And so it's not like it's not complicated, but it is like,
sure,
it is kind of signaling, hey, you're welcome here.
Yeah. I mean, it was funny because I hadn't seen any of this until I joined, and the existing debugger is written in Zool, and you're thinking like, okay, like this is well written. It was written by very good engineers. And then you begin debugging something, and you don't have that separation. Like if you try to step into function.bind or .apply, you're not going to see the code behind it. But you step into a function defined in a Zool context, and all of a sudden you're in this XML file, but there's JavaScript there. So you never had that separation. You never had the polish that would go into something like a select element. So you was like this uncanny valley of like, this is incredibly powerful. You can just write in HTML, it's declarative. But, given the choice, I would choose React. And I think a lot of people
Sure.
Well, it makes sense when you say things like modern tooling too, whenever you describe like a hackable debugger for modern times. So like this modern tooling, this modern times you have referred to in this conversation, also in some of your languages, it makes sense.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about the end product, because debuggers are somewhat controversial amongst developers. In fact, I was kind of confessing to Adam before the call, like I'm not a debugger person. I'm very much I guess I go slower in terms of I just do, outputs and log variables to the console and then expose them as global. I'm a console person. Let's just say that.
Yeah.
A puts debugger if you're in Ruby land. And honestly, mostly because, like GDB was my first run-in with a debugger. And again, it wasn't imposter syndrome. I actually did not belong in GDB land. I could not figure it out for the life of me. And so I've always been like, not an anti-debugger, but I'm just not going to reach for one. So maybe give your pitch, because you're obviously a debugger person. You're building one. from the inside out.
Oh yeah.
And they're definitely powerful, but like, why would I use the debugger as opposed to kind of the, we'll just call the old school style that I'm still using in my day-to-day work?
I've been working on that answer for probably the past 2-3 years because
Oh, good. This should be good then.
yeah. No, I have a lot of people come up to me and confess that they're not debugger users. And we've done Twitter surveys, and I'd say the majority of people probably use the console right now.
Yeah.
You look at, oh God, I forgot what the book was. I think it's Programmers at Work, which is like Founders at Work. It write-ups on various programmers like Larry Wall. Yeah. And many of them, when asked, how do you debug? They're like, yeah, I print and I use my mind. And I do see that split because I'm trying to think about the debugger as a product with users. And I think half the people would prefer to have a tool that helps them visualize and contextualize this information. That's where I fall. And the other half are more in line of like, I either want something quick, like I'm going to print this one thing, I know what I want to find, and that's going to work. Or they want to think about it. And that's a different way of approaching the problem. All valid, but what I'd like to find a way to do is blur the two. It's like, what are the best things in the console that come from logging, and what are the things that you can only do in the debugger, and find a happy medium.
Yeah. So what are some of the things you can only do in the debugger?
Well, the console is great if you know what you're looking for. So, for example, if you're logging a render function and you're saying like, hey, I only want to look at this one value, like this prop in a React render. Console is great because you can see, first of all, like, all right, I got 10 logs, I probably had 10 renders, and my number went from like 2 to 20, and I could see how it stepped. So you get this like over time perspective. With the debugger, if you're not sure what you're looking for, like you're not sure about the API, you're not sure like if you can call that function, like user.update, does that take 2 parameters, 3? What happens if I try each one? The debugger is perfect for like stopping in time and exploring that space and then moving on.
So the ability to stop in time is really you set a breakpoint. You can stop at this specific line, and then it stops the world right there. And you can inspect and dork around from there.
Totally. And it's not just at a line, although I think that's the most common, but you can say like, stop at this line in this scenario with a conditional breakpoint, or we're trying to do other ways of stopping. So you can pause on an exception, or a DOM breakpoint where an attribute changes, or an XHR breakpoint, or like on a click. Or the one that I really want to do is pause when this value is undefined. Because like how many times you get undefined is not a function, you're like, where is this? Or like you got your render and you're like, okay, yeah, I didn't expect it to like render with false. But when did it become false? And you don't really know like the context of where that thing was set. So if we could help you stop at the right time, then you could probably figure out what's going on a lot faster.
Yeah. I feel like you're in a great position to do a lot of good when you're building a debugger, especially if you have an eye for design and user experience, because undoubtedly there's a lot of power in there, but it's hidden under the covers or under the shroud of mystery, perhaps. And you know, and like I like your idea of kind of blurring the lines, because somebody who's hanging out in the console and they just aren't getting the answers that they need. The answers might be over there in the debugger, but how are they ever going to know, first of all, that the answers are there, and then secondly, how to go about getting them? And so are there any efforts from you, or even from, I'm starting to think about Egghead and Khan Academy, or whoever, anybody else teaching programming or teaching. I know there's DevTools courses, but are there concerted efforts around education with the debugger, and then also making it more approachable?
Yeah, I think so. Going back to the history again, I think there was this idea of like Firefox versus Chrome versus IE back in the past. And these days, there's a lot more collaboration. So we're talking to the Chrome team, we're really talking to the Edge team, and then we're stealing each other's ideas. So Nuclide has a debugger now. VS Code has a debugger now. And we can borrow the best ideas. And the other way that I think good ideas are bubbling up is that frameworks, they also know more about the running application. Like a lot of these browser debuggers assume you're running vanilla JavaScript. It's here are the variables and all the data. Here's the file with everything. Like you have a call stack with maybe 50 frames, maybe 100 if you're doing something really crazy. But the framework knows a lot more about your application just by virtue of like having some structure. So what we're trying to do is reach out to them. And if you're paused and you're looking at a variable and it's an immutable object, like, hey, we can format a little better so you don't see all that like immutable wrapping stuff. You just see like, here's your record with the values you care about.
Yeah, I like the trend of the larger JS frameworks, having their own tooling inside of DevTools, whether it's Chrome, Firefox, or otherwise, because like you said, they just have that. They can have the intimate knowledge of the way the frameworks works, so it helps expose things at more appropriate times.
One of the arguments for going from Zool to something like React, which was what we chose for our front end, was that, we can look at it two ways. Either we're the browser and we're going to build the best web platform, or we're going to be part of the community. And hey, if we're using React and if we're using Redux and Immutable and other tools, if we have source maps as well with like Webpack and Babel, we're more inclined to work more closely with them. And because we're feeling the pain and we're part of the community, we're going to try to improve that story as much as possible as well. So these days, like as we think about 2017, now that we have a new debugger UI and a really good console and whatnot, our goal is to say, can we take the React development experience and build the best tools for them? Not because we don't care about Angular and we don't care about other tools, but sometimes it really helps be hyper-focused and say, like, hey, we care about this. Can we try out some things that work really well here? And then we can apply some of those learnings.
Very interesting. While we're hitting up against our next break, we have more details to discuss. I think specifically, we would like to talk a little bit about React and Redux, the choice, the implications, and what that's meant for the project, as well as look at some of the stuff you're doing with the debugging protocols and kind of this idea of, as you say in the README, developing a broader community that wants to create great tools for the web, and exactly how you're going about doing that. So we will pause here and we'll discuss those things after this short break.
Our friends at ThoughtWorks have an awesome open source continuous delivery server called GoCD. Head to gocd.io/changelog to learn more. GoCD lets you model complex workflows, promote trusted artifacts, see how your workflow really works, deploy any version, anytime, run and grok your tests, compare builds, take advantage of plugins, and more. Once again, head to gocd.io/changelog to learn more. And now back to the show.
All right, we are back, and Jason, modern tooling. So big choices made at a certain point, probably when the thing got started, was, what kind of JavaScript app will the debugger for JavaScript apps be? Turns out you chose React, you chose Redux. We want to talk about that decision as well as what that has meant. Has it been a win? Have you been faster? Kind of the reasons for it. But before that, I'd like to ask you kind of a meta question. Which is, historically, and by that I mean the last 5 years or so, maybe 10 years, JavaScript ecosystem has moved so quickly, and frameworks have come and gone, and tools have come and gone. It's difficult to pick a horse in the race, and React in the last couple of years seems to have grabbed the mind share a little bit. A lot of it. In fact, I just mentioned this, Adam, in Changelog Weekly, the last issue, which, by the way, if you're not subscribed to Changelog Weekly out there, what's wrong? Just do it. Changelog.com/weekly. We linked to a thing called Reactide or React IDE. I don't know how you pronounce it. And the comment that I added is, it seems that React has hit critical mass, because anytime there's an IDE for your JavaScript rendering engine, it seems like there's this is a sticky. So just your thoughts, because you guys jumped on the React bandwagon. And I would be afraid to like go all in on something like that because maybe there's something better coming next. But do you think React is like quote unquote winning in the JavaScript front end space?
I think it was the right decision for us. And I give James Long a lot of credit. He, from the very early days, kind of identified this as something exciting and blogged a lot about it and got to know Christopher Chadeau and Dan Abramov quite well. So he did the early evangelism and planning for the rewrite. He actually got Redux into the debugger before we started .html. So we were in a really good spot when we started the rewrite of the components. What works really well for us is that the debugger is one application, but it's also a lot of components that each do their own thing. So the call stack is very isolated from the scopes and variables view, which is once again like really different than the editor and the tree. And if we do it right, then other people might want to use these components as well. So I remember getting started on the Ruby REPLs, and I wanted to build a front end, but where do you even start? There's just so much that you'd want. And if we play our cards right, like these components could be reused in other projects so you could start up faster, showing a call stack, showing variables, the tree. All these things are very reusable and might not even be tied to a language. Just like, hey, here's some building blocks for building your own developer tools.
So it's worked really well for you. You dodged my question, which was a nice dodge. But well, I guess
put him on the spot. He had to. He had to call it a winner.
That's the fun. Well, he said it works well for them. It just seems like it feels like there's a congealing. And I'm not saying like nothing new is going to come out, but just the excitement. React is old enough now that if it was a typical hype cycle, it would now be in like what do we call it, the trough of disillusionment or something. Like people would be hating it now. It should be the next thing already, but it's still here.
Yeah.
And so just as watchers of the community, we start to wonder maybe like React actually is going to be the thing in JavaScript for the next 5 years or something like that.
I think that's a reasonable question, at least. I know as a browser company, we're looking for things that are, maybe there's a different React, but we like these ideas of rendering out to a component.
Right.
And that probably would be around.
Yeah.
I think it's too soon to say in some ways. Like things like Elm are doing so much, and Ember will really help you if you're building out an application and you care more about the server piece, for instance, and deploying and the CLI. Those are things that just aren't concerns for us. So if you're just looking for this like component model, then React is really appealing, and you can use 100% of it, as opposed to maybe like 40% of Ember or 40% of Angular.
Right. All right, very good. Let's leave that topic there. I think we covered it well enough. Let's talk about this idea of runs anywhere. So one of your major pitches of why the debugger is interesting is that it runs everywhere. And of course, it's the Firefox debugger. But what's it mean that it runs anywhere, and why is that attractive or interesting to folks?
So our dream is to build one debugger that could run in its own application. Imagine spinning up a debugger, like clicking on an icon, and there it is running an Electron and pointing it at any JavaScript runtime. Obviously, you can debug Firefox, but you can also debug Chrome or Node or an app on your phone, whether it be like iOS or Android. And that's appealing for a couple reasons. One, you don't have to like relearn a tool or use a tool you don't want to use just because that's the only way to debug, like, I don't know, a Node app. The other is you can begin customizing that tool a lot. So if you've got a standalone app, it begins to feel like Hyperterm or Atom, where you say, you know what, I'm using this all the time. I'm going to build out some plugins or use some plugins that are really, really awesome and that customize my experience. So the direction I want to go in is, or we want to go in with these tools, is say, how do we build out an ecosystem for this app that's built with React, immutable flow, or maybe TypeScript. And then the team can say, all right, these are the plugins of choice. And all of a sudden, you don't just have like a JavaScript debugger, but you have a debugger for React, for TypeScript, and whatnot. And you can just do so much more in that world. The other piece is if you're at a company like Facebook, or I come from Etsy, or you can be like a Stripe, you've got a lot of front-end engineers and you've got your own internal tooling and libraries. So if we could do something where you could quickly build out plugins or settings that work really well for your app, now we can make these companies lives a little bit better as well.
Does that mean that this is a standalone app then, or it will be, or what phase are we in with Debugger?
So we do the development in GitHub, and I'm primarily running it in a tab like you would if you built any React app with like Webpack, development server, you name it. And you can point it at Firefox, point it at Chrome, and it speaks over a WebSocket to these browsers. But that's not like how we want to ship. We want to treat Firefox like a deploy target, just like we would treat that Electron app like a deploy target. So with Firefox, we try to do a weekly deploy where we make a bundle, and then we make a commit into Firefox where it gets the most up-to-date, like latest, greatest stuff. And when it comes time to ship the standalone app, which I've always thought we're 1 month out, we'll see. Hopefully sometime, maybe June, maybe the summer, we'll see. Then we'll treat that as another deploy target where you're still working with like Webpack dev server and whatnot, talking over a WebSocket, but we can do continuous deployment to the standalone app and like a weekly or daily release cycle to Firefox.
Because you mentioned Hyper as a point of reference and maybe even some inspiration. It seems like maybe that's a route you're heading potentially.
Yeah, I think they showed that if you build your app with React and Redux, that gives you a lot of extensions for plugins. So it's really easy to put something in the React middleware, for instance, and wrap a component like a terminal tab with a prompt. And it's just as easy to do that with Redux, where you can have a hook before the action's dispatched or after the action's dispatched to like do some good stuff. And I don't know if that would be the direction we're going, but that's definitely how I see these plugins being built.
When we're looking at going back to, I think, the second segment of the show, talking about the naming schema, .html, one, it's an invitation, but two, it's also saying, no longer Zool, more modern tooling. Does that mean that the other tabs in developer tools are taking a similar direction, or is it simply this makes sense for Debugger to be potentially a standalone app, run anywhere, have many targets, be shippable with even Electron or something like that?
I don't know how applicable that is for the inspector, for instance. So this is getting into the nitty-gritty.
Right.
The debugger protocol is pretty consistent, like well-established between Firefox and Chrome and whatnot. The inspector protocol and some others as well, much, much crazier. So we'll see. I think Perf has a route forward to do universal performance measuring, and their tool is beautiful, and they're doing some really good stuff there. Network Monitor, probably the same story. Console, probably the same story. The inspector, probably not right now, but maybe it's too soon to say.
So the way to run Debugger as a standalone app now is you're cloning the repo, you're pulling it down, and you're running in a tab essentially. And via some background configs, you're pointing it at Firefox or whatever other JavaScript runtime. But the future will be different.
Yeah, that's true. One thing that I'm really excited about is that we can tweet out that we want to work on like dark theme or we want to work on search, and people can come in and git clone yarn install. We started using yarn recently.
Yeah.
Yarn start, and that launches this app, which from there you can do all like your settings, like turn on some features, turn on dark theme, and then click a button and that connects to Firefox and you see the tabs, right? Connects to Chrome. So we've really focused on bring people in and getting them started really quickly. So like less than 5 minutes.
So it's UI driven, like not so much config driven. Then this connecting to different.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That was one question I had in the pre-call with Jared. Was like, I back to the run anywhere thing. I was like, okay, so what does this mean then? So it seems like most of the documentation isn't. And Jared said, well, you're a developer, dude. You're going to pull this down. So I kind of felt like an idiot. I was like, well, I thought maybe what phase of the ad I figured with the run anywhere, maybe you had like a developer focus, like if you want to contribute and push code back or whatnot. But then you also have the user focus. And it seemed like there was some user focused documentation missing, but maybe it was all in one. So I was sort of lost on how do I actually begin to use this unless I'm in Firefox, basically.
Yeah, sure. The user focus just hasn't been a thing yet. And it's never been as important as shipping the new debugger in Firefox, which has always been like the goal. There's just so much UI that every time you think you're done, you realize, oh gosh, hovering on a variable, wow, there's so much more there. Or searching through code and whatnot, there's more you can do. But yeah, the user focus, I think, is a really exciting angle. In that direction, our goal with Node, for instance, is to add something like a debug command, like debug.js, and that would invoke Node on your behalf and open the debugger. So you immediately have the debugger open, you can add your breakpoints or whatever. We might even go down the direction of doing some editor integrations as well. Because we have this Redux backend, the entire API for driving the debugger is in Redux. There's like an action for add breakpoint. There's another action for like stepping, like step over, step in. Everything you want to do is exposed this way. So it'd be really easy to build out an add-on plugin that just drives Firefox or drives Chrome. Like you just like connect, and then you're connected to a tab, and you get the really like beautiful add-on UI you might want, which is totally different than our React components, but shares the utils and obviously shares the Redux backend. James worked with Tom Cholmy, who is on our team and is very involved in the Emacs community. I think he was like the guy who built out the initial package manager for Emacs. And last summer put together a demo of our debugger running in Emacs with a separate node process. And I had everything from like kind of like GDB in a way where you're using shortcuts to add breakpoints and then you can step and whatnot. But it just showed me that all this stuff would be possible once we launch, and then we can continue to like build out the plugins and engage these different communities that would like to have a really, really good JavaScript debugger in their editor or wherever.
So just last episode, we had Kent C. Dodds on the show, and we were talking all about community around open source, first-time contributors, making it easy for people, rewarding for people to get involved and really building that out. And so maybe I'm more aware of it than I usually am, but just looking at the README that you have here, you guys have done a really good job of making the project very approachable, just in a few ways that I will list out. So you have development guides, and all broken down into those different sections that you're talking about: themes, prefs, flow logging. You have like a step-by-step, like here's how you get started. And then once you get started, here's how you can actually claim it up for grabs issue, for instance. We're happy to help. Very inclusive. You have a contributing guide. You have a code of conduct. You have a Slack. You have a community call every Tuesday. There's a DevTool call every Tuesday. All this stuff is just right there for people to see. So I guess not really a question, but I've noticed that you guys are really putting the effort in here.
For sure.
Yeah, and hopefully it's paying off.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I look at a couple metrics as often as I can, and one of them is how many contributions come from the community versus Mozilla. And in July, October, that was around 1/3, 2/3. And 1/3 from the community is a really good ratio. But at this point, it's now 2/3, 1/3. So we couldn't be here now if it weren't for people getting involved and playing a really, really big role. And that means function search, variable search, even the text search. largely came from the community. Our tabs came from the community. Previewing was one of these funny ones because in order to hover on a variable and figure out what to show, you need to parse the JavaScript and figure out what the logical expression is. So if you're hovering on like var a equals 2, when you hover on a, like, okay, I've got a in scope, I can go get that value. But if you're hovering on like this dot model and your cursor is on like model, you're like, oh gosh, I need to figure out that the entire expression is this dot model. And that's been a really fun feature to work on because many of our contributors who've been around for 3, 4, 5 months saw some of these features that are described out in our issue list as like, parse the JavaScript and figure out an expression, or figure out which scope we're in, and it's possible a variable is shadowed by another variable. So like a is 2 in this context, but 3 in that context. Let's go get the right one. And they're like, can I do that? Can I please do that? That looks really cool.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden we have this preview that I want to confirm this, like, but I'm pretty sure Chrome isn't doing things in this space that we are. So for instance, it's really neat to say like the shadowing. If you hover on A in the inner scope, you're going to get a different value than the outer scope, as opposed to like 2 in both cases. Or if you pause and unclick and then you mouse over, like, I don't know, unmouse over, which is a totally another function, that should be inert. But in most cases, you're mousing over the same variable like this in both cases. And we're going to show the pop-up because, hey, we're not checking what the scope is. We don't know what the lexical scoping is at that level. But because we built out this community, all of a sudden we're doing polish because it's cool. And that's like the CSS with tabs. We don't have the time to like really get in and make sure everything lines up beautifully, but they do. And like they notice those things. And same thing with preview.
I got stuck on, you said that you have to parse the JavaScript. You're not parsing that JavaScript with your own JavaScript, are you? Or I hear Firefox has a good JavaScript parser built in.
Yeah, right. I'm so glad you asked this.
In fact, I just got stuck there and just was thinking about that for the last few minutes. So hopefully I was the only one. Everybody else followed you.
I followed.
No. This is like the nerdiest detail that gives me the most excitement at this point. So I'm really glad you asked. A month and a half ago, maybe 2 months ago, we decided to use Babel on the client. It's like in addition to React and Redux to parse the JavaScript. And that could not have been a better decision.
Really?
So what we realized when we started using it was Babel has a plugin for everything. Like we wanted to parse the code that people are actually writing these days, which could be, I don't know, TypeScript or Flow, or obviously all the Babel plugins, new JavaScript features. And if we handed that code to the Firefox parser, it'd be like, you're doing what?
Right.
No, but Babel gets it. And the other thing is Babel's API is such a joy to work with that all of a sudden we're doing these things like, hey, your cursor is in this scope, but once again, like we're shadowing another variable in another scope. And that stuff is just really fun to do. So a friend of mine,
client-side Babel, that's pretty rad.
Pretty cool. And it makes things like building an outline view or function search fun again.
Probably beats that regular expression you had previously.
Yeah, that's what it was, man. That's the best practice.
How'd I guess?
You're like, oh, I see a colon. Maybe that means we're in an object. Okay.
Right.
Let me look at the left colon. Oh, that's the key. Great.
What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah. And when we can tweet out that we're using Babel, and we recently started using Jest and Prettier, and when we can get more involved in the community with our tooling, it's so exciting. Like those are the things that really get picked up. And
that's my takeaway from this call is when Jared asked, I think it was mostly in the break there, but this new type of open source, as the ping repo mentioned from team that show up, was how you've sort of let go of older models of how you typically did things to embrace, for lack of better terms, the community. And go into the trenches, which is something we say around here lots, is like going into the trenches with everyone else. Because if you look left and you look right and you're in a trench and no one else is around, you're in the wrong trench, So you've got to be in the trench with the right people to help them. Otherwise, you're just standing alone, probably getting shot or ambushed in.
Not good.
No,
not good.
It's not the place to be.
Yeah. That makes me think of when we were getting ready to launch about a month ago. Firefox was on a 6-week release cycle. We have nightly edition and whatnot. I personally have never done a good job of keeping track of where I am in that cycle. So I'm constantly surprised, like, oh gosh, I've got 2 weeks and we got to release this thing. Okay. And we were in that spot a month ago and looked at the to-do list and was like 30 issues. And you just know that some of these things would become like more issues because that's how it goes when you want to polish. And I was like, okay, let's schedule 10 days. Like, this is not good. And had I sat down and just like worked around the clock, I could have gotten like 12 of those done. But instead, I just began like pinging people who'd worked on the project actively in the past month, people who'd worked on it actively like 2 months ago, but I knew had like schoolwork or something else. I was like, hey, can you help out? You did some tabs work. These are the things we need there. You did some search work. Or God, like I remember the source tree needed some stuff where like source maps, like the domains like mapped well with Webpack. This is it. Here's the issue. Like, are you interested in helping us get ready for launch? And it was killer. It was the most fun we had. Everyone came in and chipped in and it was fun. It was good. And that kind of thing would never have happened had we not put the work in to build out those people who care about the project, who know about it and can help us out, jump in the trench.
That's a good place to ask for a call to action. So speaking of trenches, speaking of the community, where are some good inroads? I know that you'd mentioned you use a different word versus help wanted, but what's the term you use for certain issues that's like come help out or something like that? Like how can people step in? Those who are listening to the show, they're like, I want to get involved. This sounds cool. I want to work with Jason, and the rest of the team to make this thing what they're talking about in this show. What's the best ways for people to onboard and help out?
So we used to call these issues up for grab issues.
Okay.
We recently switched it to available issues to be a little bit more international. It turns out that up for grabs does not translate well.
Okay.
If someone were interested in getting involved, I would love it if they stopped by our Slack room and just said like, hey, this looks like a good project. We've got a really great team of about 5 to 6, maybe, I don't know, community members who are eager to mentor and get involved with like holding your hand on that first issue. But we've also seen most of the people come in, and once you do that, git clone, yarn start, you're running a React app and you can use any dev tools you want. Like, you can inspect it and see like, oh, that's the HTML, or you can use the debugger that ships with like Chrome or Firefox to debug it. So I've seen people get involved in like 20, 30 minutes and immediately help us add flow to a file or pick up a UI bug and run with it.
I might want to suggest, instead of available, I think that the standard term, Jared, is help wanted, right? Is that a pretty common standard? Is that not a standard these days for inviting folks to jump in? We use help wanted, right?
Yeah, but I don't know what's best or standard. I just know that I've seen that, I use that, but available probably is just as good.
Just as good.
Maybe help wanted translates poorly and we just don't know it yet.
It very well might. It very well might.
I don't know. You're saying that. I kind of like help wanted.
Well, then take the advice.
Well, but that's what I see a lot of people using. At least that's what I thought was a standard. And so then when I saw what you all call it, which was up for grabs, I was like, that's kind of cool too. But
yeah,
yeah,
it's relaxed. Okay, you want to grab this? Grab it.
Grabs, yeah. But if you don't grab it, I'm gonna.
I know there's a website, up for grabs, I think .com.
Oh, really?
Lists out projects that have issues that are up for grabs. The reason we went with available was we don't want to say like, hey, these issues are for the community and these issues are for us. We want as many issues as possible to be available to work on. And for us, available means we've thought through the UX and we have a spec for what we're looking for, what that end state is. We can even include a patch. So you can say in a patch, here's the component and the function we think you can work on. Here's a solution that we think will work, but it's just pseudocode. So like it may work, it may not. And a lot of these things just come back and make the project better. So for instance, we were trying to do dark theme, and we do RTL and translations as well. And it was a really sad day in October when we were looking at the project and we were like, man, we haven't translated any of the strings. And Brian was ready to go to his manager. We're like, I think it's important to ship. We'll do translations later. But translating and being international and global is a real value of ours. And when we thought about doing the work, we didn't have a good way of doing translated strings in what we call the launch pad in the local development mode. And so instead of saying, okay, well, for internationalization, we're going to do it in Firefox in the mono repo, we found a way to get that done in the launch pad and then file 20 issues, right? Translating the source tree, translating the scopes, and same thing with the dark theme. And that brought people in as well. So if we can make things available and have really good docs, really crisp descriptions, then we all win. It's easier for us to work on it. It's also easier for people to jump in and help out.
Yeah. Well, we're getting close on time, but I want to give you a chance to give a final shout out to those listening. Anything else we may have missed, we'll put everything we've talked about in the show notes. Our listeners know about that, but any last resource or piece of advice you want to share back to the community before we tail off? Just debug.
Just debug. Oh, I'll give one tip, and this is a shout out for Chrome DevTools and browser DevTools at large. If you're interested in seeing how the inspector works or the debugger works in Chrome, you can undock DevTools and then do Command Option I, and it opens another DevTools that allows you to inspect the former one.
Wow.
And for Firefox, you can open up DevTools, go to Settings, and then there's a little checkbox for browser and Chrome debugging. And you go up to Developer, and then you can select a menu item called Browser Toolbox. And with that DevTools that's opened, you can actually inspect our tabs, Firefox's tabs UI. And you can change the URL bar to pink. So as a final shout out, I'd say, do one of those two things. Check out what's happening under the hood, how your browser is working, how DevTools are doing what it's doing. You won't regret it. It's really fun, really accessible, and you won't look at development the same way again.
There you go. Make sure you do that. Those two things. And we'll have your Twitter and Slack, all that stuff in the show notes. So if anyone listening does that, give Jason a shout out. But Jason, thanks so much for taking the time to come on. Thank you for your passion for doing what you're doing and turning the Jareds of the world into potentially debuggers. Who knows? We'll see. But thanks for coming on the show, man. Much appreciated.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
All right, that wraps up this episode of The Changelog. Join the community and Slack with us. Head to changelog.com/community. Follow us on Twitter. We're at Changelog. Special thanks to our sponsors, Linode, TopTal, and GoCD. Also, thanks to Fastly, our bandwidth partner. Head to fastly.com to learn more. Also, thanks to Breakmaster Cylinder for the awesome beats. If you're one of many people emailing us, tweeting us, asking about our theme musics and whether or not you can listen to them or download them, we have something coming very soon. It's a mixtape. You'll be able to buy it, which is super cool to support us and these awesome shows we produce. So stay tuned for that. We'll see you again next week. Thanks for listening.